The South by Jorge Luis Borges. The man that disembarked in Buenos Aires in 1871 was named Johannes Dahlmann, and was a pastor of the Evangelical Church. In 1939, one of his grandchildren, Juan Dahlmann, was a secretary of a municipal library on Cordoba Street, and he profoundly felt Argentinian. His maternal grandfather had been Francisco Flores, of the 2nd Line Infantry Division, that died on the frontier of Buenos Aires, speared by Indians from Catriel. In the discord between two lines of ancestry, Juan Dahlmann, perhaps driven by his Germanic blood, chose the line represented by his Romantic ancestor of the Romantic death. An old sword, a leather frame containing the portrait of a blank-faced man with a beard, the dash and grace of certain music, the familiar stanzas of Martin Fierro, the passing years, boredom and solitude, all went to foster this voluntary, but never ostentatious nationalism. At the cost of numerous small deprivations, Dahlmann had managed to save the empty shell of a ranch in the south, which had belonged to the Flores family. He continually recalled the image of the balsamic eucalyptus trees and the great rose-colored house, which had once been crimson. His duties, perhaps even indolence, kept him in the city. Summer after summer, he contented himself with the abstract idea of possession, and with the certitude that his ranch was waiting for him on a precise site in the middle of the plain. Late in February 1939, something happened to him. Blind to all faults, destiny can be ruthless at one's slightest distraction. Dahlmann had succeeded in acquiring, on that very afternoon, an imperfect copy of Wilde's edition of The 1001 Nights. Excited to examine this find, he did not wait for the elevator, but hurried up the stairs. In the obscurity, something brushed by his forehead. A bat? A bird? On the face of the woman who opened the door to him, he saw horror engraved, and the hand he wiped across his face came away red with blood. The edge of a recently painted door, which someone had forgotten to close, had caused this wound. Dahlmann was able to fall asleep, but from the moment he awoke at dawn the flavor of everything was atrociously poignant. Fever wasted him, and the pictures in The 1001 Nights served to illustrate nightmares. Friends and relatives paid him visits, and, with exaggerated smiles, assured him that they thought he looked fine. Dahlmann listened to them with a kind of feeble stupor, and he marveled at their not knowing that he was in hell. 8 days passed, and they were like 8 centuries. One afternoon the usual doctor appeared, accompanied by a new doctor, and they carried him off to a hospital in Ecuador Street, for it was necessary to x-ray him. Dahlmann, in the taxi which bore them away, thought that he would at last be able to sleep in a room different from his own. He felt happy and communicative. When he arrived at his destination, they undressed him, shaved his head, bound him with metal fastenings to a stretcher. They shone bright lights on him until he was blind and dizzy, examined him with a stethoscope, and a masked man stuck a needle into his arm. He awoke with a feeling of nausea, covered with a bandage, in a cell similar to a well, and in the days and nights which followed the operation he came to realize that he had merely been, up until then, in a suburb of hell. Ice in his mouth did not leave the least trace of freshness. During these days Dahlmann hated himself in minute detail. He hated his identity, his bodily necessities, his humiliation, the beard which bristled upon his face. He stoically endured the curative measures, which were painful, but when the surgeon told him he had been at the point of death from septicemia, Dahlmann dissolved in tears of self-pity for his fate. Physical wretchedness and the incessant anticipation of horrible nights had not allowed him time to think of anything so abstract as death. On another day the surgeon told him he was healing, and that very soon he would be able to go to his ranch to recover. Incredibly enough, the promised day arrived. Reality favors symmetries and slight anachronisms. Dahlmann had arrived at the hospital in a taxi, and now a taxi was to take him to the Constitution Station. The first freshness of autumn, after the summer's oppressiveness, seemed like a natural symbol of his rescue and release from fever and death. The city, at 7 in the morning, had not lost the air of an old house filled during the night. The streets seemed like long vestibules. The plazas were like patios. Dahlmann recognized the city with joy on the edge of vertigo. A second before his eyes registered the phenomena themselves, he recalled the corners, the billboards, and the modest variety of Buenos Aires. In the yellow light of the new day, all things returned to him. No one ignores that the South begins at the other side of Rivadavia. Dahlmann was in the habit of saying that this was no mere convention, that whoever crosses this street enters a more ancient and sterner world. From the car he sought out, among the new buildings, the iron grill windows, the brass knocker, the arched door, the entranceway, the intimate patio. At the railroad station he noted that he still had 30 minutes. He quickly recalled that in a cafe on the Brazil Street, a few dozen feet from Irigoyen's house, there was an enormous cat which allowed itself to be caressed, as if it were disdainfully divinity. He entered the cafe. There was the cat, asleep. He ordered a cup of coffee, slowly stirred the sugar, sipped it. This pleasure had been denied him in the clinic, and thought, as he smoothed the cat's black coat, that this contact was an illusion, and that the two beings, man and cat, were as good as separated by a glass, for man lives in time, in succession, while the magical animal lives in the present, in the eternity of the instant. Along the next to the last platform the train waited. Dahlmann walked through the train cars until he found one almost empty. He placed his suitcase in the net. When the train started off, he opened it and took out, after some hesitation, the first volume of The 1001 Nights. To travel with his book, which is so much a part of the history of his ill fortune, was a kind of affirmation that his ill fortune had been annulled. It was a joyous and secret defiance of the frustrated forces of evil. Along both sides of the train, the city dissipated into suburbs. This sight, and then a view of the gardens and villas, delayed the beginning of his reading. The truth was that Dahlmann read very little. The magnetized mountain and the genie who swore to kill his benefactor are, who would deny it, marvelous, but not so much more than the morning itself and the mere fact of being. The joy of life distracted him from paying attention to Scheherazade and her superfluous miracles. Dahlmann closed his book and allowed himself to live. The lunch, with the broth served in shining metal bowls, as in the remote summers of his childhood, was one more peaceful and rewarding delight. Tomorrow I'll wake up at the ranch, he thought, and it was as if he was two men at a time, the man who traveled through the autumn day and across the geography of the country, and the other one, locked up in a hospital and subject to methodical servitude. He saw unplastered brick houses, long and angled, timelessly watching the trains go by. He saw horsemen along the dirt roads. He saw gullies and lagoons and ranches. He saw luminous clouds that resembled marble, and all these things were accidental, causal, like dreams of the plain. He also thought he recognized trees and planted fields, but he would not have been able to name them, for his actual knowledge of the countryside was quite inferior to his nostalgic and literary knowledge. From time to time he slept, and his dreams were animated by the impetus of the train. The intolerable white sun of high noon had already become the yellow sun which precedes nightfall, and it would not be long before it would turn red. The railroad car was now also different. It was not the same as the one which had left the station at Constitution. The plane and the hours had transfigured it. Outside, the moving shadow of the railroad car stretched toward the horizon. The elemental earth was not perturbed either by settlements or other signs of humanity. The country was vast, but at the same time intimate, and in some measure secret. The limitless country sometimes contained only a solitary bull. The solitude was perfect, perhaps hostile, and it might have occurred to Dahlmann that he was traveling into the past and not merely south. He was distracted from these considerations by the railroad inspector who, on reading his ticket, advised him that the train would not let him off at the regular station, but at another, an earlier stop, one scarcely known to Dahlmann. The man added an explanation which Dahlmann did not attempt to understand, and which he hardly heard, for the mechanism of the events did not concern him. The train laboriously ground to a halt. practically in the middle of the plain. The station lay on the other side of the tracks. It was not much more than a shed. There was no means of conveyance to be seen, but the station chief supposed that the traveler might secure a vehicle from a general store to be found some 10 or 12 blocks away. Dahlmann accepted the walk as a small adventure. The sun had already disappeared from view, but a final splendor exalted the vivid and silent plain. Before the night erased its color, less to avoid fatigue than to draw out his enjoyment of these sights, Dahlmann slowly walked, breathing in the odor of clover with sumptuous joy. The general store at one time had been painted a deep scarlet, but the years had tempered this violent color for its own good. Something in its poor architecture recalled a steel engraving, perhaps one from an old edition of Pablo in Virginia. A number of horses were hitched up to the tethering post. Once inside, Dahlmann thought he recognized the shopkeeper. Then he realized that he had been deceived by the man's resemblance to one of the male nurses in the hospital. When the shopkeeper heard Dahlmann's request, he said he would have the cart readied. In order to add one more event to that day and kill time, Dahlmann decided to eat at the general store. Some country toughs, to whom Dahlmann did not at first pay any attention, were eating and drinking at one of the tables. On the floor and hanging onto the bar squatted an old man, immobile as an object. His years had reduced and polished him as water does a stone or the generations of men doing a sentence. He was dark, dried up, diminutive, and seemed outside time, situated in eternity. Dahlmann noted with satisfaction the kerchief, the thick poncho, the long chaps, and the gaucho boots, and told himself, as he recalled futile discussions with people from the north or from the province of Entre Rios, that gauchos like this no longer existed outside the south. Dahlmann sat down next to the window. The darkness began overcoming the plain, but the odor and sound of the earth penetrated the iron bars of the window. The shop owner brought him sardines, followed by some roast meat. Dahlmann washed down the meal with several glasses of red wine. Idling, he relished the tart flavor of the wine, and let his gaze, now grown somewhat drowsy, wander over the shop. A kerosene lamp hung from a beam. There were 3 customers at the other table. 2 of them appeared to be farm workers. The third man, whose features hinted at Chinese blood, was drinking with his hat on. Suddenly, Dahlmann felt something brush lightly against his face. Next to the heavy glass of turbid wine, upon one of the stripes on the tablecloth, lay a ball of breadcrumbs. That was all, but someone had thrown it there. The men at the other table seemed totally cut off from him. Perplexed, Dahlmann decided that nothing had happened, and he opened the volume of the 1001 Nights by way of suppressing reality. After a few moments, another little ball landed on his table, and now the peons laughed outright. Dahlmann said to himself that he was not frightened, but he reasoned that it would be a major blunder if he, still recovering, were to allow himself to be dragged by strangers into some chaotic quarrel. He determined to leave, and had already gotten to his feet when the owner came up and urged him in an alarmed voice. "Senor Dahlmann, don't pay any attention to those lads. They're half drunk." Dahlmann was not surprised to learn that the other man now knew his name. But he felt that these conciliatory words served only to aggravate the situation. Previous to the moment, the peon's provocation was directed against an unknown face, against no one in particular, almost against no one at all. Now it was an attack against him, against his name, and his neighbors knew it. Dahlmann pushed the owner aside, confronted the peons, and demanded to know what they wanted of him. The tough guy with the Chinese look staggered heavily to his feet. Almost in Juan Dahlmann's face he shouted insults, as if he had been a long way off. He played to exaggerate his drunkenness, and this exaggeration was a ferocious mockery. Between curses and obscenities, he threw a long knife into the air, followed it with his eyes and caught it, and challenged Dahlmann to a knife fight. The owner objected in a tremulous voice, pointing out that Dahlmann was unarmed. At this point, something unforeseeable occurred. From a corner of the room, the old, ecstatic gaucho, in whom Dahlmann saw a summary and cipher of the South, his South, threw him an uncased dagger, which landed at his feet. It was as if the South had resolved that Dahlmann should accept the duel. Dahlmann bent over to pick up the dagger, and felt two things. The first, that this almost instinctive act bound him to fight. The second, that the weapon, in his clumsy hand, was no defense at all, but would merely serve to justify his murder. He had once played with a dagger, like all men, but his idea of fencing and knife play did not go further than the notion that all strokes should be directed upwards, with the cutting edge held inwards. They would not have allowed such things to happen to me in the hospital, he thought. "Let's go outside," said the other man. They went out, and if Dahlmann was without hope, he was also without fear. As he crossed the threshold, he felt that to die in a knife fight, under the open sky and attacking, would have been a liberation, a joy, and a festive occasion. On the first night in the hospital, when they stuck him with the needle, he felt that if he had been able to choose then, or to dream his death, this would have been the death he would have chosen or dreamt. Firmly clutching his knife, which he perhaps didn't know how to wield, Dahlmann went out into the plain.